All right, so let's go through and do another lovely fun video. So today we're going to talk about applying research and writing a draft. Now that you are almost done, today's Wednesday, so you would be turning this in on Friday, your literature review. Almost done with that, and then it is time to move on to your research paper. So I will have that assignment sheet on D2L by tomorrow, and I will go over it in class on Thursday and next Tuesday so that everybody can ask questions if they need to. But remember that the final draft of your literature review is due this Friday, which is 2 days from now, 1 day from the day you're probably watching this, hopefully not after, by 11:59. Make sure that you look over that researched argument assignment sheet to see if you've got any questions. And remember, we do not have a quiz this week. Even though I'm teaching you some new information in this video, we're not doing a quiz this week. I want you to focus on finishing your literature review. But make sure you complete your discussion by Friday. Normally it's till Sunday, but it's peer review, and there's no point doing peer review after the paper's due. So it closes on Friday this week, so make sure you're doing that. All right, so now that we are moving from the little bit of research you've done into the rest of your research paper and working all that stuff in together, and actually now answering your research question, let's look at some things that you need to focus on there. So before starting your research argument, ask yourself, how has my thinking changed based on my research? So have you learned new information as you've gone through doing your research that has changed perhaps the answer you thought you were going to give, or even the question that you're going to ask in the first place? And that's fine. That's how research will develop your ideas about things, and so it may change, and that's going to happen. Was my working thesis on target? Do I need to rework my thesis based on what I've learned? So the thesis you turned into me originally is not necessarily going to be the final one that's in your paper, and I'm actually going to get you to turn in your new thesis to me in a couple of weeks. So start thinking about that, based on the research that you've got. What your new question perhaps might be, and what your thesis is going to be. So how does the information in my sources mesh with my research questions and help me answer those questions? So how has the research that you found actually helping you answer that question? Hopefully so, because otherwise you're going to have to do more research. Have any additional important questions or subtopics come up that I will need to address in my paper? Hopefully, you got 7 pages that you got to cover, so you're going to have some more questions and subtopics in there that kind of feed back into that main question that you're going to cover within your paper. How do my sources complement each other? What ideas or facts recur in multiple sources? So think about that. You've already been looking at your sources and comparing and contrasting them in your literature review. So you are already thinking about how they compare and contrast with each other. And now you've got to at least have 5 sources for your final paper. So continue to think about how they are working with each other to answer your question. And where do they disagree with each other, and why are they disagreeing with each other? What's the reason behind the argument that's showing that they have different arguments? So you're going to be thinking about those kind of things. So when it comes to selecting useful details, now is the time to think about how you will use the research you've gathered. You've got a whole bunch of stuff. You're not going to use all of it. You probably found a lot of good information, but you can't use all of it. Not all of it's going to feed back into the research question. Some of it's going to kind of go off a little bit too far away from the main topic that you want to cover, or it may stray a little too far from that actual question. The subtopics you come up with, you can't put everything in there. So now's the time to start going through and pulling out stuff that's most directly related, most relevant for the argument that you're going to be doing. So use those critical thinking skills to filter out and kind of figure out what it is that you're going to use. And make sure all the subtopics you cover for support in your paper are closely related to your main argument. Don't give me something way off the wall, that is something that's not, is closely related enough that makes sense in the paper. So beginning with the supporting details that clearly back up your thesis this is when you start writing. So think about, as you're going through these, is this detail from a reliable, high quality source? We've already talked about how you are to evaluate your sources. So is it going to be appropriate to cite it in an academic paper? Think about if it's an academic source, or not. So make sure that it's something that's comes from a reliable source, and make sure that you are using all reliable sources. Is the link between the information in my thesis obvious, or will I need to explain it to my reader? So you probably know a good bit about your topic. You've read a lot about it. You know a lot about your sources. So some of the connections may be really obvious to you. They may be obvious to other readers too, but you are going to have to explain, provide analysis for all the outside information that you are putting in your paper. So you can't just throw in paraphrases and quotes and that kind of stuff and not tell me why is that quote important? Why is that particular source? How is that helping you support your argument? I need to know with every bit of outside information, I need you to analyze that and tell me why it's important. Why did you choose it? How is it helping you make your argument? What personal biases or experiences might affect the way I interpret this information? You are going to have a bias probably about your topic because you all chose things that you care about. So make sure that you are not letting those biases creep into the writing, and that you're trying to stay as objective as possible, and that you're presenting the most objective argument that you can. So you all have personal opinions and experiences that are going to influence your reactions, but good researchers are aware of that, and they keep an open mind, and they look at all different sides of the argument, because you are going to present not just your side, but you're going to present other sides of that argument as well. So when you're using support that goes against your thesis, remember, don't just throw that away. You are going to need to present a counter argument. That's how you show a non-biased argument, is you say, okay, this is my argument, this is how I feel. Now, some people think this way about it. However, that side of the argument isn't as valid because. So remember that you are going to have to tell me about that counter argument in your paper. Then you go on to refute it. So don't throw away the sources just because they argue against your thesis or the argument you're trying to make. You're going to use those. So you may have a source or two in your paper that completely argues against the thesis you're trying to present. That's fine, because that's part of what you've got to do. You can show that there are other sides to the argument, and then you point out why your side of the argument is the one that is most reliable. So, and also as you're working through your thesis, possibly changing your thesis or your research question a little bit, you might actually find one of those sources actually follows along with the new working thesis. So don't just throw away everything that you've done. Just make sure you keep it, and just in case, you never know what you might use, and consider how all the research fits into the big picture of your paper. So finding connections between sources. You should have already started doing this when you did the literature review, but do most sources seem to agree on a particular idea? If something's going to be repeated over and over again, then that's going to be something that you can use to strengthen your argument, but please do not don't quote the same thing from a bunch of different sources. Don't say this source says this, and then this source says the same thing, and then this source says the same thing. You're not strengthening your argument, you're just repeating yourself. So there's going to be some correlation between your sources, but you don't want to just quote the same thing over and over again from different sources. Think about the key terms or major concepts that a lot of your sources are covering. Think about, does one author, one of the writers, refer to another person's article or book? Because that they're playing off of each other, and are they saying that the other person they're referring to did a good job, or they're not doing a good job supporting the argument, or they have different viewpoints? Think about that if they're talking, because sometimes they literally talk about each other when they're writing. So think about that. Identify those different connections, and it's going to help you flow from one point to another in your paper. Be aware of any redundancies. Like I said, if a new source is not adding anything new to your paper, don't use it. Just to have a certain number of sources. If you've got 5 sources and 3 of them are saying the same thing, and you're telling me the same thing from all 3 sources, that counts as one source. So make sure all your sources are going to contribute to your paper in a different way. Make sure that you're not just quoting the same thing over and over again. If you find significant disagreements among reliable sources, you need to review and evaluate each source. Make sure that the disagreements, that somebody is presenting a sound argument, and which one has more solid evidence. Figure out which one of those sources is more credible and why it is. Then you go on to, we talked about reevaluating your working thesis. Careful analysis of your notes may help you. You may change that working thesis. Remember, a working thesis means that it is still being worked on, like a working title in a movie. That's the title for now, but when it finally gets to theaters, it may be something different. And so the same thing with your thesis. This is the thesis you've got now. By the time you turn that paper in, it may be something different. So you need to figure out, go back and look at it and say, okay, is my research or my interest in the subject still pointing towards the same thesis, or has my mind changed? Even if your sources generally confirm that preliminary thinking on the topic, still a good idea to think about maybe the wording itself, and maybe get some more specific details in there that you've learned from your actual research. So synthesizing source material. You're going to put all the pieces together. I don't know why it says all the piece together. That was a typo. So analyze how your notes relate to your major research question and the sub-questions you identify from the start. So remember, you've got your main major research question, but there's also going to be some smaller sub-questions that feed into that. And we'll talk about that in class and give you some examples. Organize your notes with headings that correspond to those questions. So I'm going to ask you probably to turn in an outline as well, and it's going to be more like a topic outline. So it'll be your thesis statement, and then it'll be the topic sentences from your different supporting paragraphs. So it's not going to be a full where you have to fill out everything that's going to be in your paper, but it will help you lay out how your supporting paragraphs are going to read and how they're going to feed back into that thesis. And then begin jotting down the big ideas you're going to use to connect the dots for your readers. So you're going to answer obviously your major research question and those other sub-questions, and answer new questions as appropriate as you're going through and finding more things. You're going to come up with possibly more questions. So planning how to organize your paper. We talked about organizational structures in class. Could be chronological order. It's probably going to be order of importance. You're going to talk about which one of your arguments is the strongest. You may start with that one. You may end with that one. Please don't hide it in the middle, because that can kind of be confusing. But think about the order of importance. I mean, even when you're looking at your main question, the sub-questions that feed into it, which is the most important question to answer that's going to help support the thesis for your research question. So some paragraphs in your paper will consist mostly of details from your research, which is fine. Make sure you are explaining to me why those details are important. How are they linked to your question? How are they linked to each other? What does it mean? Why did you choose that? Tell me what it means. Also include sentences and transitions that show the relationship between different claims and evidence from your research by grouping related ideas together or pointing out connections or contrast. So you're not just giving me a bunch of information. You have to synthesize it, you have to analyze it, and you have to interpret it. So you're not, if I wanted to read your sources, I could go and read your sources. You're not just plopping in information from your sources. You're telling me why it's important and how it is answering your research question. And once you've done all that fun planning, it's time to write your draft. So research papers generally follow the same basic structure. We've already talked about this, but this was in the book, so I thought I would cover it a little bit. You're going to have an intro, present your thesis. It's going to give me some interesting information. It's going to hook my attention, and then it's going to give me the answer to your research question. This time, your thesis statement, answer to your research question. You finally get to answer your research question. A body is not a word, but there should be a space in there. So a body section that develops a thesis with supporting points and evidence. So you got all your, that's going to be the big chunk of it. That's going to be most of your 7 pages. And then you got to have a conclusion that restates that thesis in different words and provides additional insights, or you can give you that final thought or that call to action, different things that we talked about in class. There was a section in the book where it talked about writing your intro and conclusion. I'm not going to go over that again because I just did a video about that. So refer back to that video. I think it was last week or the week before. And there's also some slides on D12 if you don't want to watch the whole video and listen to my lovely commentary on them. But your writing voice will come across most strongly in your introduction and your conclusion, because you're attracting your reader's interest and you're establishing your thesis and you're giving us the main ideas that you're going to cover. Do not cite sources usually You might refer to one, but you're not going to cite sources at length in your intro or your conclusion. That's where I don't need real specifics in your intro or your conclusion. That's what your body paragraphs are for. And you certainly shouldn't be giving me new information when you get to your conclusion, because that's not concluding, that's continuing. Remember the funnel and the reverse funnel methods that we talked about in the other class or in the other video, where your intro starts out general, gets specific, and then your conclusion starts out specific with the restatement of your thesis, and then goes out to be more general. And we talked about already primary and secondary research. Remember, primary sources present firsthand information. That's people who are actually there, people that are talking about their own research, things that they've actually done, versus secondary sources, one step removed. They're looking at analysis or interpretations of those primary sources. As much as possible, use secondary sources that are closely linked to primary research, such as journal articles. Like we talked about, at least one of your literature review sources has to be supposed to be a journal article. So think about that. Think about using things that are just maybe one step away from that primary research that's analyzing that kind of stuff. Journal article, it presents the results of a scientific study, or a book that cites interviews and case studies. These sources are more reliable and add more value to your paper than sources that are further removed from primary research. If you get something that quotes something that quotes something that quotes something else, that's like fourth place. So you need to get something that is as closely related to that primary research or at that actual primary research as you can. Incorporating source material into your body paragraphs. As you draft your body paragraphs, you must express your critical thinking about the ideas and information. Offer claims of your own that either challenge or extend points from your sources. Don't rely on your sources to make your argument. Use your sources to support the argument you are presenting. So you're supporting your own ideas. You're not using someone else's ideas as your own. So you'll need to integrate ideas carefully at the paragraph level and the sentence level, using those topic sentences, using concluding sentences in those body paragraphs, so that the readers can understand what's important about the evidence that you're using in there. You must continually explain how source material relates to your thesis. Again, you're going to talk about that thesis throughout that paper. You're going to feel like you're repeating yourself constantly, and you will be. But everything that you put in that paper, I want you to remind me, okay, this is why this supports this thesis. This is why this is important. So remember to keep going back to that thesis. You'll also include sentences that transition between ideas from your research, either within a paragraph or from one paragraph to the next. So you should have lots of transitional words and transitional sentences that are going to help me flow through that paper as I'm reading it. So also, when we're talking about quoting, paraphrasing, summarizing, don't just plop in something. I don't want to see a quote sitting by itself as a sentence. You need to think about how you're going to introduce all that outside information. So you need a signal phrase in your text to help you integrate source material smoothly. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in class. But an example would be starting a sentence that says, as Jackson argues in his paper, quotation title, and then you give me a quote or you give me a paraphrase there. Give me some kind of signal phrase that shows, okay, now I can tell by the beginning of this sentence that this information is coming from a certain source, and I can even pretty much tell just by that signaling phrase what source it's coming from if I look at your works cited page. So citation technique also helps convey that you're actively engaged with your source material, and don't just say as they state or as they write. Those are kind of generic. You can use those, but just don't use them over and over again. And so I've given you some different, well, the book really did, and I just typed them and pretended they were mine. So, but I gave you some ideas here for as someone argues or they ask. People ask questions when they're giving research too. They believe, they compare, they find, they insist, like use some different verbs to make it a little bit more interesting. Warn, that one sounds ominous. So when you're using sources, we've talked about this before, but just in general, summary is going to be taking a large piece of information and making it concise, making it smaller. So you're going to take an entire piece and you're going to tell me what the main points of it in just a sentence or two maybe, versus a paraphrase is going to be restating the information, but using a smaller piece of information. So maybe you're going to paraphrase a sentence or two, and your paraphrase is going to end up being a sentence or two long as well. So you're going to take a certain amount of information, you're going to make it about the same length, but you're using your entirely different, your own words and your own sentence structure. A lot of people like to just go, okay, I'm just going to take a thesaurus and I'm going to replace some words with words that mean the same thing, but it'll read different. That's not the same thing. That's keeping the same sentence structure, which is not paraphrasing. That is considered plagiarism, and you will be in trouble for that, so don't do it. And, of course, quoting. If you find something that the author said in a really vivid way or a really important way that you just can't really mix it up, you can't figure out a way to make it your own words, then just quote it directly. Don't rely on those for the entire paper. I want to see paraphrases. I want to see summaries. I don't want to see a whole bunch of quotes. But if you can't figure out another way to say it, then quote it. So, like I said, use it fairly sparingly, rely more on the paraphrasing, the summary. But when you are quoting sources, make sure that you have transcribed the original statement accurately. Make sure that you're putting everything in there that is there and represent the author's ideas honestly. Make sure that you are quoting enough to reflect the author's point accurately. If you talk about like a movie review, for example, and somebody says, my mom would think that this is the best movie that she's ever seen, but I thought it was trash. If somebody quotes that and says, the best movie she's ever seen, that's going to be obviously not the quote from the person. That would be using a piece of it to serve your own purpose, but not accurately representing what the author was trying to say. Never use a standalone or dropped-in quotation. Make sure that it is part of your own sentence. In other words, your sentence shouldn't start with quotation marks and end with quotation marks. It obviously should have an in-text citation after every piece of it too. But it should be worked in with your sentence. So it should have those signaling phrases and things like that in there. Use ellipsis if you need to omit words or phrases. So you may have an entire paragraph that the first part of it and the last part of it are going to be the part that you really want to use, and the middle part doesn't necessarily help at all, or it just doesn't need to be there. So if you're starting a quote, ending a quote, you're leaving out any words in there, then you need to put an ellipses in there. If you're changing any words, say for example, you're changing it to, if somebody's saying personally that, I feel like blah, 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 and you work into it and say, you want to say she instead to do it third person, then you would use brackets to change any words or any words to different things, or add an explanation or anything, clarification on the original. Make sure any omissions or changed words do not alter the meaning of the original text. So you aren't going to omit stuff that is going to change the meaning of what you're trying to say. So you only do that when it's absolutely necessary to shorten it or make it more grammatically correct within your sentence. Remember to include correctly formatted citations that follow the assigned style guide. So I should see an in-text citation, parenthetical citation, after every bit of outside information. If I don't, then that is considered plagiarism, and it makes me angry, so don't do that. All right, so we're going to talk about this more in class, and we're going to be working on our research argument in class over the next couple of weeks. It's going to be due the Friday before you leave for Thanksgiving, so you still have a good bit of time to work on that. But just a reminder on assignments, final draft of your literature review is due on Friday. That is the 23rd of October. And remember, no quiz this week, but remember to do your peer review, which is the same thing as your discussion. Your discussion this week is your peer review. By Friday, not Sunday, Friday. And remember that peer review is part of your writing process grade, so that works into 25% of your overall grade. So you want to make sure that you're doing that, because that's a lot of points off to not do that. So make sure you're getting in there and do that. And everyone, make sure if you have any questions that you let me know.